Wife locks millionaire's sick black adoptive mother in basement on Christmas. He opens door and finds the truth. A self-made millionaire returns home for Christmas expecting celebration and warmth, only to discover his sick adoptive mother has been locked in the basement by the woman he trusted most. What appears as a perfect holiday gathering masks the most brutal betrayal hidden beneath the music and laughter. She believes her husband's love makes her untouchable, and that appearances matter more than humanity. But she never expects a son's instinct to lead him to open a door that was never meant to be touched. What follows is a collision of prejudice, cruelty, and consequences that shatters an untouchable image in seconds. Stay with us, because once truth enters this house, the story takes a turn no one at that party could have imagined. Tell us, what would you do if you discovered someone you loved had been hiding this kind of secret? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The Moreno mansion glowed on Christmas Eve as if it were made of light itself. Crystal chandeliers cast warm gold across polished marble floors. Garland wound elegantly around the grand staircase, each strand perfectly placed, each ornament catching and scattering light. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, mixing with expensive perfume and cologne. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, their polished surfaces reflecting the flood of decorative lights trained on the entrance. Soft Christmas music drifted through the open halls, rising and falling with the rhythm of conversation and laughter. It was Christmas Eve, and everything about the evening had been designed to showcase success, to celebrate a man who had built an empire from nothing and never forgot to be grateful. Guests moved easily through the grand hall, men in tailored suits and women in shimmering cocktail dresses. Glasses of champagne were lifted again and again. Toasts were made to prosperity, to family, to the season. The atmosphere hummed with the comfortable energy of people who belonged to a certain world, successful, polished, connected. At the center of it all stood Clark Moreno, tall and composed in a tailored charcoal suit and crisp white shirt. A simple but expensive watch caught the light on his wrist each time he raised his champagne glass. His smile was warm and genuine, the smile of a man who built everything from nothing and never forgot where he came from. Guests moved toward him naturally, drawn to his authentic charm and the success story he represented. His dark hair was neatly styled, his presence commanding without being arrogant. There was something grounded about him, something that made people trust him instinctively. Beside him, moving gracefully through the crowd, was Karen Moreno. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown that complemented her fair complexion and auburn hair, which fell in perfect waves over her shoulders. Her makeup was flawless, sharp eyeliner, deep red lips, every detail calculated. Her smile was practiced and bright, the kind that had been perfected in front of mirrors and at hundreds of social events. She accepted compliments on the decorations, the menu, the ambience, as if she alone had orchestrated every detail. To the untrained eye, she was the perfect wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who elevated Clark's success into something refined and elegant. Yet one painful absence hung quietly over the room. Reina Moreno, Clark's 65-year-old adoptive mother, was nowhere to be seen. More than one guest noticed. Whispers passed between small groups, careful and curious. A few older women glanced toward the hallway leading to the back of the house, expecting to see the warm, dignified woman they'd met at previous gatherings. Reina had always been a presence at Clark's celebrations, gracious, sharp-witted, with a laugh that filled rooms and stories that made everyone lean in closer. A longtime business partner approached Clark with a polite smile, gesturing lightly with his glass. He asked almost casually where Mrs. Reina was, mentioning how much his wife had enjoyed talking with her at last year's event about gardening and old family recipes. Clark's smile faltered for just a second before Kieran's smoothly interject addition. She placed her hand gently on Clark's arm and explained with practiced concern that Reina had been under the weather and was resting downstairs in the guest suite where it was quieter. The doctor had advised limiting stimulation, she added, her tone perfectly calibrated between worry and reassurance. You know how it is, Kieran said softly, implying fragility and the inevitable decline of age. The partner nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his drink. But Clark's eyes lingered on Kieran for a moment longer than usual. Something in her tone felt rehearsed, too smooth, like a line delivered on cue. He tried to remember when he last saw his mother. This morning? Yesterday? The past few days blurred together in his mind, filled with last-minute business calls and holiday preparations that Kieran insisted on handling alone. Kieran's confidence was unmistakable. She stood beneath the chandeliers as if the house itself recognized her authority. When guests complimented the stunning floral arrangements or the exquisite catering, she accepted the praise with a gracious nod, as though her taste alone had made it all possible. The band shifted into a softer melody. Servers glided between guests with trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. Laughter rose louder now, fueled by alcohol and festivity. The Christmas tree towered near the window, its ornaments catching and scattering light like captured stars. Everything gleamed. Everything sparkled. Everything looked perfect. Yet the staircase leading upward stood empty. No footsteps sounded from above. No message arrived excusing Raina's absence. The silence surrounding her grew heavier with each passing minute. Not because it was spoken of, but because it was not. As the evening deepened, Clark found himself repeatedly glancing toward the back hallway, toward the part of the house where Kieran claimed Raina was resting. Each time he considered excusing himself to check on her, Kieran appeared at his elbow with another guest to meet, another toast to make, another moment that demanded his attention. Her hand rested on his arm, light but persistent, guiding him away from that hallway again and again. At one point, Clark paused near the base of the staircase, his hand resting lightly on the polished banister. He looked up briefly toward the upper floors where his mother's suite was located. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened on the wood before Kieran's voice pulled him back. "Darling, the Hendersons are leaving soon. They wanted to say goodbye." Clark turned away from the stairs. The party pressed forward with deliberate energy, determined to remain flawless. Kieran orchestrated it all with subtle gestures, directing staff with a look, refreshing conversations with perfectly timed interventions, ensuring no one lingered too long in any one place where uncomfortable questions might take root. The camera of attention, if it could move beyond the glittering celebration, would begin to drift away from the chandeliers and the crystal. It would follow the elegant hallway past the laughter and the music, past the locked doors and the careful lies, toward a place where the Christmas lights did not reach. Downward, beneath the celebration, toward the cold depths of the house where the truth waited in darkness. The basement was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the house itself had decided to forget this space existed. The air was damp and cold, carrying the smell of concrete and old storage. A single weak bulb hung from the ceiling, its yellow light barely pushing back the shadows. The floor was bare cement, cold enough to seep through fabric and into bone. Reina Moreno sat against the wall, wrapped in thin blankets that did little against the December chill seeping through the foundation. At 65, she appeared both dignified and broken. Her dark brown skin showed an unhealthy gray undertone in the dim light. Her silver-streaked hair, usually neat and styled in elegant twists, hung loose around her shoulders, some strands clinging to her damp forehead. She wore a simple cotton nightgown and a thin cardigan, clothing meant for a warm bedroom, not this frigid tomb. A persistent cough rattled in her chest. Each breath came with visible effort, her ribcage expanding and contracting like something fragile threatening to break. She pressed one trembling hand to her ribs, where pneumonia had taken hold over the past week. The infection worsened dramatically since Kieran moved her down here 3 days ago. 3 days that felt like 3 lifetimes. On the floor beside her sat a plastic water bottle, nearly empty, and a small paper plate with remnants of stale bread from yesterday. Her medications, the antibiotics, the blood pressure pills, the vitamins her doctor prescribed, remained upstairs in her bathroom cabinet, deliberately withheld. Kieran had made sure of that. Raina's mind drifted through fever and exhaustion, pulling her back to a moment 33 years ago that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly near. She remembered the day she first held Clark. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with eyes that held too much hurt for a child. The adoption agency had warned her he'd been through multiple foster homes, that he didn't trust easily, that he might never call her mama. But Raina saw something in him that day, a spark of resilience beneath the fear, a desperate need for love hidden behind walls built too young. She took his small hand in hers, feeling how cold his fingers were, and promised him something she'd spent every day since keeping. "You'll never be alone again, baby. Never." He'd looked up at her with those wounded eyes and whispered, "Promise?" "I promise," she'd said. "Cross my heart." Now, sitting in this basement prison, Raina wondered if that promise still held. If Clark even knew where she was. If he'd noticed her absence at all. 3 days ago, she'd been in her upstairs bedroom recovering from what she thought was a bad cold. Kieran had entered with tea, insisting Raina drink it all. "It'll help you sleep," Kieran had said with that practiced smile. Within an hour, Raina felt dizzy and disoriented, the room spinning like a carnival ride. Through the fog in her mind, she remembered Kieran's voice, cold, businesslike, stripped of any pretense. Clark's Christmas celebration can't be disrupted by illness. Especially not by your kind of illness. Raina remembered being half-carried, half-dragged downstairs she didn't recognize. Her feet stumbling on steps that seemed to multiply. The click of a lock. Kieran's face in the doorway, composed and final, backlit by hallway light that made her look almost demonic. "Don't bother screaming," Kieran had said. "No one will hear you. And even if they did, who would believe you over me?" Then the door had closed, leaving Raina in darkness, so complete it felt like being buried alive. Now, music drifted down through the structure of the house. Laughter followed, then the soft clink of glasses. The sounds were distant but cruelly clear. Raina recognized the Christmas carols, Silver Bells, the Christmas song, Joy to the World. Songs she used to play while decorating the tree with young Clark, his small hands reaching up to place ornaments while she steadied him, their laughter mixing with Nat King Cole's voice. The irony cut deeper than the cold. Directly above her head, in the house she'd helped Clark buy with her life savings, in the home where she should be welcomed and cherished, a celebration continued as if she didn't exist, as if she'd never existed. Earlier today, when she still had more strength, Raina had tried calling out. She'd pounded on the door until her knuckles bled, leaving dark smears on the metal. She'd shouted Clark's name until her voice gave out, reduced to a hoarse whisper that barely carried beyond the basement walls. No one came. The basement was positioned in the oldest part of the mansion, its walls thick, its location remote from the main gathering spaces. Kieran had chosen this space deliberately, the way a predator chooses the perfect hunting ground. The pneumonia worsened by the hour. Raina's fever climbed, bringing chills that made her shake uncontrollably despite the blankets wrapped around her thin frame. She knew enough about illness to recognize the danger. Without antibiotics, without warmth, without proper hydration, her condition would become critical. She was already feeling the edges of consciousness blur. Moments of confusion where she forgot where she was, moments when she saw Clark as a little boy standing in the corner of the basement, asking her why she'd left him. "I didn't leave you, baby," she whispered to the hallucination. "I'm right here." But he disappeared like smoke, and she was alone again. What hurt more than the physical suffering was the betrayal. Not from Kieran. Raina had always sensed the coldness beneath her daughter-in-law's polished exterior. The way Kieran's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at Raina. But the situation itself. That she could be erased so easily. That her son, whom she'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, was upstairs laughing and toasting while she suffered below. She knew Clark didn't know. He couldn't know and allow this. Her baby had a good heart, a protective heart. But that he hadn't noticed, hadn't asked, hadn't felt her absence like a missing limb. That broke something inside her that had nothing to do with pneumonia. Still, Raina refused to surrender. She'd survived too much in her 65 years to give up now. She'd survived poverty, racism, the loss of her husband to cancer when Clark was 15. She'd worked 3 jobs to put Clark through college, her hands cracked and bleeding from cleaning office buildings at night. She'd survived the whispers when she adopted a mixed-race child as a single black woman in a judgmental community. She would survive this too. Raina conserved what energy remained. She drank the water in tiny sips to make it last. She changed position every hour to prevent bed sores and maintain circulation. She wrapped the blankets more strategically, keeping her core warm even as her extremities went numb. And she listened for footsteps, listened for opportunity, listened for her son's voice among the others, waiting for the moment when he might be close enough to hear her if she could summon one more scream. Her hand trembled as she reached for the water bottle. Above her, the Christmas music swelled, a full choir singing "Joy to the World." The irony was almost funny. Almost. Raina closed her eyes, and a single tear traced down her cheek, leaving a warm trail that cooled instantly in the frigid air. She pressed her hand against the cold concrete floor, feeling the vibrations of footsteps and music from the party above. So close. Her son was so close, just beyond these walls, these floors, this locked door. She whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible even to herself, each word carrying the weight of 33 years of love. "Clark, baby, please. Please look for me. Remember what I taught you. Listen to your heart. It'll tell you when something's wrong. It'll lead you home." The music played on. The party continued. And in the basement, wrapped in inadequate blankets on unforgiving concrete, a mother waited for her son to remember the promise they'd made to each other all those years ago. "You'll never be alone." Never. But tonight, in this moment, Raina had never felt more alone in her life. Upstairs, Kieran Moreno moved through the party with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Every smile was measured. Every word was calculated. She had transformed herself into the embodiment of the perfect Christmas hostess, and she wore the role like armor, beautiful, impenetrable, deadly. Her emerald gown caught the light as she glided from group to group, refreshing drinks, steering conversations, ensuring no one lingered too long in any one place where uncomfortable questions might take root. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny. She complimented women she secretly despised. She touched arms and shoulders with practiced intimacy, making everyone feel seen, valued, important. This was her domain, her kingdom, and she ruled it with absolute control. When an elderly woman named Margaret Pemberton asked specifically about Raina, mentioning a knitting project they'd discussed months ago and how she'd brought yarn to gift her, Kieran's expression shifted to one of practiced sympathy. She placed her hand gently on Margaret's arm, leaning in as if sharing something confidential. "Oh, Margaret, that's so thoughtful of you," Kieran said softly. "But I'm afraid Raina's health has been declining more rapidly than we'd hoped. She's simply not up to socializing anymore. The confusion, the fatigue, it's been difficult to watch." She paused, allowing a shadow of concern to cross her face. "You know how it is with age. One day they're fine, and the next." She trailed off meaningfully. Margaret's face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh, the poor dear. Please tell her I'm thinking of her. And if there's anything I can do." "Your prayers would mean everything," Kieran interrupted smoothly, squeezing Margaret's arm before gracefully extracting herself from the conversation. Across the room, Clark watched this exchange. Something about Kieran's body language troubled him. She stood too straight, spoke too smoothly, like an actress who'd rehearsed her lines until they lost all authenticity. He'd built a business empire partially on reading people, on detecting the micro-expressions that revealed truth beneath polish. And right now, his wife was performing. He set down his champagne glass and began moving toward the back hallway. Before he'd taken 5 steps, Kieran materialized at his side. Her hand slipped around his arm, warm and possessive, her fingers pressing just slightly too hard against his suit jacket. She steered him toward a group of his most important investors, her voice bright and charming. "Darling, the Harrisons have been hoping to discuss the upcoming merger with you. You know how excited they are about the tech sector expansion." Clark allowed himself to be redirected, but his eyes kept drifting toward that hallway. The one that led past the kitchen, past the service areas, to the older section of the house where memories lived in dusty corners. Where his mother should be resting. Where something felt desperately, terribly wrong. An hour into the party, during a lull in conversation, Clark heard it. A sound so faint he wasn't certain it was real. A thud, distant and muffled, like something heavy falling or someone striking a surface. It came from beneath his feet, from somewhere below the main floor. He paused mid-sentence, his head tilting slightly. The businessman he was talking to, Robert Harrison, didn't seem to notice, continuing his story about market fluctuations and quarterly projections. But Clark's entire focus had shifted downward, toward that sound, toward the inexplicable feeling that something was calling to him. From across the room, Kieran noticed. She saw the exact moment Clark's attention shifted, saw his body language change from relaxed to alert. Her face remained composed, but her hand tightened around her champagne glass until her knuckles whitened. She excused herself from her conversation with forced casualness and began moving toward her husband, her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor. Clark's mind raced. He thought of his mother. When had he last actually seen her? Kieran said she was resting in the downstairs guest suite. But that didn't make sense. That suite was on the main floor, in the opposite direction from where the sound came from. His mother had lived in this house for 3 years, in her own suite upstairs with a view of the garden she loved. Why would she be downstairs? Why would she be in the old section of the house? A memory surfaced unexpectedly, sharp and painful. Last week, before the Christmas preparations consumed everything, he'd asked Kieran about Raina's cough. He'd heard it through the walls one night, a deep, rattling sound that worried him. "Just a minor cold," Kieran had said dismissively, not looking up from her phone. "Nothing to worry about. I'm handling it. You focus on closing the Henderson deal." And he had. God help him. He had trusted his wife to care for his mother while he focused on business, on money, on things that suddenly seemed utterly meaningless. "Clark." Kieran's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood before him with a bright smile and a plate of hors d'oeuvres, but her eyes were sharp, calculating, searching his face for signs of suspicion. "The caterer wants to know when to serve dinner. Should they wait another 30 minutes? Her voice was light, casual, but there was an edge beneath it that he'd never noticed before. Or maybe he had noticed and chose to ignore it. Clark turned to face her fully, and in that moment, something shifted between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that the performance was cracking. "Where exactly is my mother?" His voice was low, meant only for her ears, but it carried a weight that made her smile falter. Kieran's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance? Fear? Before the mask returned. She touched his cheek gently, a gesture that appeared affectionate to observers, but carried an edge of control, of warning. "I told you, darling. She's resting. The poor woman is exhausted and frankly." She lowered her voice even further. "A bit confused lately. Disoriented. The doctor said it's best not to disturb her. You know how elderly people can get agitated, saying things that don't make sense. I didn't want to worry you during your important celebration." "What doctor?" Clark asked, the question sharp and immediate. Kieran hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Clark saw it. The pause, the calculation, the construction of a lie. "Dr. Patterson," she said, naming their family physician. "He came by yesterday afternoon while you were at the office. He examined her and recommended rest and isolation. Something about not wanting her to spread the infection to the guests." Clark made a mental note to call Patterson first thing tomorrow morning. But tomorrow felt too far away. The unease in his chest was growing, spreading like the pneumonia he didn't yet know was killing his mother below his feet. Another sound. slightly louder this time. A creak, a scrape, something that made two other guests nearby pause their conversation and tilt their heads. Old houses, one of them commented with a laugh. Always settling, always making noise. Everyone laughed, tension breaking like a soap bubble. Everyone except Clark. And everyone except Kieran. They stood locked in a moment of silent combat, husband and wife, trust and suspicion, love and something darker that Clark was only beginning to recognize. Kieran sensed she was losing control of the narrative. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper that trembled with manufactured concern. "Fine. If you must know, your mother had an episode this afternoon." She became agitated, confused, combative even. She was saying things that didn't make sense, getting upset over nothing, accusing me of... She broke off, as if the words were too painful to speak. I had to move her somewhere quiet where she could calm down. I didn't want to worry you before your party. I was protecting you, Clark. Protecting us. The explanation should have satisfied him. It contained all the right elements: medical concern, protective instinct, consideration for his important evening. But something in Kieran's eyes contradicted her words. Something cold and calculated that didn't match the worried wife she was pretending to be. Clark had seen his mother handle crisis with grace. He'd seen her sick before. She'd worked through flu, through migraines, through exhaustion that would have broken weaker people. Agitated and confused didn't match the woman who'd raised him with quiet strength and unshakable dignity. "I want to see her." It wasn't a request. His voice carried the same tone he used in boardrooms when negotiations ended and decisions became final. Kieran's face hardened for just a moment before the concern returned, but Clark had seen it. The flash of anger, of fear, of something desperate and dangerous. "Of course, darling. After the party. Let's not disrupt everything now. Your investors are here, the Harrisons were just saying." "Now, Kieran." Clark cut her off, his jaw set with determination she recognized from business negotiations. When he made this face, arguments became futile. He'd already decided. "I want to see my mother now." The music swelled around them, cheerful and bright. Silver bells played from hidden speakers, the chorus singing about Christmas in the city. Guests laughed and toasted, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding in their midst. Kieran's hand remained on Clark's arm, but her grip was no longer gentle. It was restraining, desperate, the grip of someone watching their carefully constructed world begin to collapse. And beneath their feet, in the cold darkness below, Raina pressed her hand against the floor and tried one more time to make a sound loud enough to reach the sun she was terrified she'd never see again. She struck the concrete with the empty water bottle, once, twice, 3 times, using strength she didn't know she still possessed. The sound traveled upward through old wood and stone, through decades of foundation, through the structure of a house that held too many secrets. And this time Clark heard it clearly. His eyes locked with Kieran's, and in that moment, she knew she'd lost. Clark pulled away from Kieran's grip with such force that she stumbled backward, her heel catching on the marble floor. His jaw was set with a determination that made something inside her panic. When Clark made decisions, real decisions, nothing could change his mind. Not charm, not manipulation, not even love. He strode toward the back hallway, his expensive shoes echoing against marble, then hardwood, the sound of each step like a countdown, like thunder before lightning strikes. "Clark, wait." Kieran's voice cracked, the polished veneer finally splintering. He didn't turn around, didn't slow down. Behind him, a few guests noticed his abrupt departure. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. But Kieran quickly intercepted their curiosity with a practiced laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Business call," she announced to no one in particular, her voice slightly too bright, slightly too loud. "You know, Clark, even on Christmas Eve, deals don't stop." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's what makes him successful, right? Always working." The guests chuckled knowingly, accepting the lie because it was easier than questioning it. The wealthy understood. Money never sleeps. Ambition never rests. They returned to their conversations while Kieran hurried after her husband, her emerald gown swishing against her legs, her heart pounding against her ribcage like something trying to escape. The back hallway was dimly lit compared to the brilliant main rooms. The Christmas decorations thinned out here, replaced by the plain functionality of service areas. Clark passed the kitchen where catering staff worked efficiently, their heads down, focused on trays of appetizers and champagne refills. None of them looked up. None of them wanted to see whatever drama was unfolding between the millionaire and his wife. Clark continued beyond the kitchen, into parts of the house he rarely visited. The older section. The original structure from when the mansion was first built over a century ago. Here, the walls were thicker, the ceilings lower, the air somehow heavier with age and forgotten things. Kieran caught up, slightly breathless, her heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood floor. "Clark, please," she said, her voice strained, losing its careful modulation. "This isn't necessary. Your mother is fine. You're embarrassing yourself, embarrassing us, walking away from your own party like this." Clark didn't slow down. His eyes scanned the hallway, searching for something he couldn't name, but knew he'd recognize when he saw it. "Which room?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. Kieran hesitated, just a fraction too long. "The basement guest suite, I told you." Clark stopped so abruptly she nearly collided with him. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her step backward. "We don't have a basement guest suite," he said slowly, each word deliberate and cold. "We have storage and utilities. Nothing else." "Where is she?" He turned a corner and found himself facing a heavy door he'd walked past 100 times without really seeing it. The basement entrance. It was part of the house's original structure, solid oak darkened with age, with old-fashioned hinges that spoke of a different era. And across it, incongruously new and shining like an obscenity, was a padlock. A heavy-duty padlock securing a thick metal hasp that had been recently installed. The screws were bright silver, barely tarnished, the wood around them still showing fresh damage where the drill had bit into century-old oak. Clark stared at the lock as if it were a foreign object, as if his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. His hand reached out slowly, fingers trembling, and touched the cold metal. The lock was real, solid, deliberate. "What is this?" His voice came out quiet, dangerous, the kind of quiet that preceded violence or heartbreak or both. Behind him, Kieran stood frozen, and when he turned to face her, he saw something he'd never seen before in their 5 years of marriage. Raw, undisguised fear. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup, her lips slightly parted, her eyes wide like an animal caught in headlights. "Where's the key?" Clark asked. His voice was carefully controlled, but his hands were shaking now, trembling with rage or terror, or the awful understanding beginning to dawn in his chest. Kieran straightened her spine, attempting to regain composure, attempting to resurrect the mask that had served her so well for so long. "Clark, let's talk about this rationally. Your mother, she's been difficult lately, and I was only trying to. Where is the key?" The shout echoed through the hallway, so loud that it carried back to the kitchen. A catering worker dropped a tray with a crash that seemed to punctuate Clark's fury. Kieran flinched as if he'd struck her. In all their years together, she'd never heard him raise his voice like this. In business, he was known for staying calm under pressure, for negotiating with ice-cold precision. This was different. This was personal. This was primal. Kieran's carefully constructed world was collapsing, and she knew it. She could see it in his eyes, the way he was looking at her now, as if seeing her for the first time, as if all the layers of charm and beauty and performance had been stripped away, leaving only the truth beneath. Sensing her control slipping irreparably, Kieran tried a different approach. Her eyes filled with tears, real or performed. Clark could no longer tell and no longer cared. Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "I did it for you," she said, the words tumbling out. "For us. For our future." She was becoming a liability, Clark. Sick, yes, but also problematic. The way she talks, the way she acts around our friends. Your business associates, they judge these things. They see her and they see. She trailed off, but the silence was more damning than any words. Clark's face transformed. The truth crashed over him like ice water, like drowning, like falling from a great height with no ground in sight. This wasn't about illness. This wasn't about inconvenience or confusion or medical necessity. Say it, he demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Finish what you were going to say. Kieran's mouth opened and closed. Her hands twisted together, ringing like Lady Macbeth trying to wash away invisible blood. They see her, she finally continued, her voice barely audible. And they question your judgment. They question your background, where you came from. They see a successful man with she swallowed hard, with a woman who doesn't fit the image, who doesn't belong in our world. The words hung in the air between them, poisonous and irretrievable. Clark's stomach turned. His brilliant, kind, dignified black mother who raised him when no one else would, reduced to an embarrassment, reduced to a problem to be hidden, to be locked away like something shameful. The full weight of Kieran's prejudice, carefully concealed behind sophistication and charm for 5 years, now stood exposed in this dim hallway like a tumor finally cut open. Without another word, Clark tried the door. It rattled violently but held firm, the new lock mocking his efforts. "Mama!" he shouted through the heavy wood, his voice breaking on the word. "Mama, are you down there? Can you hear me?" He listened, pressing his ear against the door, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear anything else. For a terrible moment, there was only silence. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a sound. A weak cry. A scraping noise, like something being dragged across concrete. And then his mother's voice, hoarse and broken, barely human but unmistakably hers, calling his name. "Clark, baby." Something primal ignited in Clark. Something ancient and protective and furious beyond reason. He threw his shoulder against the door with all his weight. The old wood groaned, but the modern lock held firm. He stepped back and kicked near the handle, his expensive leather shoe connecting with oak. Once, the impact jarred through his leg. Twice, the frame began to splinter. 3 times, and would cracked with a sound like bones breaking. Kieran grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Stop it. You're making a scene. People will hear. Think about what this looks like. Think about your reputation." Clark shook her off with such force she stumbled backward, catching herself against the wall. He turned on her, and the look in his eyes made her shrink away. "Good," he snarled, his voice unrecognizable. "Let them hear. Let everyone hear. Let the whole world hear what you've done." One more powerful kick, and the door frame cracked completely. The screws holding the hasp pulled partially free from the wood. Clark grabbed the door and pulled with all his strength, his hands bleeding where splinters bit into his palms. The remaining screws tore out with a shriek of wood and metal, and the door swung open. A wave of cold, damp air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of mildew and sickness and something worse. The smell of suffering, of neglect, of human cruelty made manifest. The weak light from the basement revealed wooden stairs descending into darkness. Clark didn't hesitate. He rushed down the stairs 2 at a time, his shoes echoing on the wood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mama!" he called out, his voice breaking. "Mama, I'm coming. Hold on, I'm coming." Behind him, at the top of the stairs, Kieran stood frozen, her face pale, her hands shaking. Her carefully constructed world, the mansion, the status, the perfect marriage, was crumbling around her like a house built on sand. She watched her husband disappear into the basement darkness, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. At the bottom of the stairs, Clark's eyes adjusted to the dim light. He scanned the basement frantically, his heart hammering, terror and rage warring in his chest. And then he saw her. In the far corner, wrapped in thin blankets, barely visible in the shadows, looking small and broken and impossibly fragile. His mother. His beautiful, strong mother who'd raised him and loved him and sacrificed everything for him. Their eyes met across the basement, and in that moment, Clark felt something inside him break and rebuild simultaneously. "Oh God," he whispered, running to her, dropping to his knees on the cold concrete. "Oh God, Mama, what did she do to you?" And Raina, using every ounce of remaining strength, reached up with a trembling hand to touch her son's face, to make sure he was real, that this wasn't another fever dream. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You found me, baby. I knew you would. I knew you'd remember." Clark gathered his mother into his arms, and the sound that escaped his throat was something between a sob and a howl. She felt impossibly light, impossibly fragile, like holding a bird with broken wings. Her body shook with violent shivers despite the blankets, her skin burning with fever beneath his touch. "I'm here, Mama. I'm here now. I've got you." His voice broke on every word, tears streaming down his face, wetting her hair where he pressed his cheek against her head. "I'm so sorry. God, I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner." Raina's hand trembled against his face, her fingers ice cold, tracing the features she'd memorized 33 years ago. "Not your fault," she whispered, each word an effort. "Never your fault." But Clark knew better. The guilt crashed over him in waves. While he'd been upstairs approving catering menus and shaking hands with investors, his mother had been dying beneath his feet. While he'd slept in his warm bed, she'd been shivering on concrete. While he'd trusted his wife to care for the woman who'd given him everything, that same wife had been systematically destroying her. He carefully adjusted her position, trying to warm her with his own body heat. And that's when he felt it, the rattling in her chest with each breath. Deep, wet, dangerous. The struggle for air that signaled serious respiratory distress. His business partner's father had died from pneumonia 2 years ago. Clark recognized the sound. He recognized the danger. "How long?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "How long have you been down here?" Raina's eyes drifted unfocused, her mind struggling through fever and exhaustion. 3 days, she whispered. "Maybe 4. I lost count. The nights were so long. 3 days. The words detonated in Clark's chest. His mother had been locked in this basement, sick and forgotten, for 3 days. While he'd conducted business meetings. While he'd slept peacefully. While he'd made love to the woman who'd done this. The woman he'd vowed to honor and cherish. The woman he'd chosen over his own mother without even realizing it. Footsteps on the stairs drew his attention. Kieran descended slowly, one hand on the railing, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Fear, defiance, and something that might have been shame buried so deep she barely recognized it herself. She stopped halfway down, as if afraid to come closer. As if some part of her finally understood the magnitude of what she'd done. "Clark, I can explain," she began, her voice trembling. "Don't." His voice cut through the basement like a blade, sharp and final. "Don't say another word. Don't you dare try to justify this." He pulled out his phone with one hand, keeping the other wrapped protectively around Raina. His fingers shook as he dialed 911. The phone rang once, twice, and Kieran watched with growing horror as her last chance at controlling the narrative slipped away. 911, what's your emergency? "I need an ambulance immediately," Clark said, his voice steady despite the rage coursing through him. He provided the address, explained that his 65-year-old mother had been trapped in a cold basement for days with what appeared to be severe pneumonia. His voice remained clinical, factual, but his eyes never left Kieran's face. "Sir, can you confirm, trapped? Do you mean she was unable to exit on her own?" "I mean she was locked down here deliberately." Clark's voice hardened. "By my wife." The door was padlocked from the outside. The operator's pause was heavy with implication. "Sir, we're dispatching paramedics now. They'll be there in approximately 7 minutes. Can you tell me about her current condition?" Clark looked down at his mother, and fresh tears blurred his vision. "She's conscious but weak. High fever. Severe respiratory distress. Dehydrated. She's been without proper food, water, or medication for 3 days. He heard the operator relay information to someone else, heard the urgency in her voice increase. "Sir, keep her warm if possible. Don't give her anything to drink yet. The paramedics will need to assess her first. Stay on the line with me." Kieran's sharp intake of breath echoed through the basement. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising with panic. "Clark, think about this. Think about what this means. The scandal, your business, our marriage." "Evidence," Clark said coldly, not looking at her. He pulled up his phone's camera with his free hand, still cradling Raina against his chest. He began taking photos. The padlock and hasp newly installed. The empty water bottle, the meager food. The thin blankets inadequate for December cold. The concrete floor. His mother's condition. Her gray pallor, her labored breathing, the way her body shook with chills and fever. "What are you doing?" Kieran repeated, descending another step, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "Documenting," Clark replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "For the police report I'm filing. For the divorce proceedings. For the criminal investigation that's about to destroy everything you've built." "Criminal investigation?" Kieran's voice cracked. "Clark, you can't. We can work this out. We can say it was a misunderstanding, that she got confused and locked herself down here." "She couldn't lock herself down here." Clark's voice was quiet, dangerous. "The padlock was on the outside. Even you're not stupid enough to think that lie would work." Raina coughed weakly, and the sound terrified Clark. He held her tighter, whispering reassurances. "Help is coming, Mama. Just hold on. Just hold on for me." Her eyes focused on him with effort, and despite everything, the pain, the betrayal, the near-death experience, she managed a small smile. "Knew you'd come," she whispered. "Knew my baby wouldn't forget me." "Never," Clark said fiercely, pressing his forehead against hers. "I will never forget you. You're my mother. You're the only parent who ever gave a damn about me. You're the only family that ever mattered." The words landed on Kieran like blows. She stared at her husband, this man she'd married for his money and status and potential, and realized she'd never actually known him at all. She'd seen ambition and success, and the ability to provide the life she wanted. She'd never seen the little boy underneath, the one who still remembered being unwanted and alone, the one who'd promised himself he'd never let anyone hurt the woman who'd saved him. Sirens pierced the night, growing louder. The 911 operator confirmed the ambulance had arrived. Clark told her he'd meet them upstairs and ended the call. He stood carefully, lifting his mother with him. She weighed almost nothing. The realization broke something in him all over again. She'd always been petite, but this was different. This was starvation and dehydration and neglect. "I'm carrying you up, Mama," he said gently. "The paramedics are here. You're going to be okay. I promise you're going to be okay." "Don't make promises," Raina whispered, a ghost of her old wisdom showing through. "Just stay with me." "Always," Clark said. "I'm never leaving your side again." He began climbing the stairs, each step careful and deliberate. Carrying his mother up from the basement felt symbolic. Lifting her from darkness into light, from death into life, from abandonment into love. Behind them, Kieran followed, her emerald gown dragging on the dusty steps, her perfect appearance disheveled for the first time all evening. She looked like what she was, a woman whose carefully constructed facade had finally collapsed. At the top of the stairs, the hallway had filled with people. Catering staff stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. A few guests who'd wandered back to investigate the commotion. And now, pushing through the crowd with professional efficiency, 2 paramedics with a gurney and emergency equipment. The crowd fell silent as Clark emerged from the basement carrying Raina. She was clearly ill, clearly suffering, wrapped in inadequate blankets, her breathing labored and wet. The contrast with the glittering party still visible down the hall was stark and damning. This was no simple illness. This was neglect. This was cruelty. This was something that shouldn't exist in a house filled with wealth and privilege. The paramedics took over immediately, their movements practiced and urgent. They lowered Raina onto the gurney, immediately checking vital signs. Clark heard words that chilled him. Severe dehydration. Temperature 104.2. Respiratory distress. Possible sepsis. We need to move fast. One paramedic, a woman named Jessica according to her name tag, looked up at Clark with concern. Sir, how long has she been in these conditions? 3 days, Clark said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. Loud enough for the guests to hear. Loud enough for there to be no doubt, no ambiguity. She was locked in the basement for 3 days without proper care. By my wife. The sharp gasp came from multiple people at once. An older woman Clark recognized as Mrs. Beverly Patterson, a longtime friend of his mother's, pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She looked from Raina to Kieran, who stood apart from everyone, isolated by her own actions. Dear God, Mrs. Patterson whispered. Kieran, how could you? But Kieran said nothing. Her face had gone blank, empty, as if she'd retreated somewhere inside herself where consequences couldn't reach. The paramedics worked quickly, starting in 4-line with practiced efficiency, placing an oxygen mask over Raina's face. Her breathing eased slightly, but her eyes remained closed, her body limp. Sir, we need to transport immediately, Jessica said. She's critical. Are you family? I'm her son, Clark said. I'm riding with her. Of course. Jessica's eyes held sympathy and something else, anger, perhaps, at what had been done to this elderly woman. As they wheeled the gurney toward the front door, the remaining party guests parted silently, forming a corridor of shocked faces and whispered horror. The Christmas tree lights seemed obscene now, garish and inappropriate. The decorations mocked the suffering that had been hidden beneath them. Kieran caught up to them at the front door, reaching for Clark's arm one last time. Clark, wait. Please. Let me explain properly. Let me come with you to the hospital. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes stopped her cold. No, he said simply. You're not coming near her ever again. This is my home too, Kieran protested, her voice rising with desperation. I have rights. You lost those rights, Clark said quietly, when you locked my mother in the basement to die. When I get back from the hospital, I want you out of this house. Pack what you need. My lawyers will contact you about the rest. You can't just throw me out. Watch me. The ambulance doors closed, separating Clark and Raina from the mansion, from Kieran, from the wreckage of what had been a perfect Christmas Eve just hours before. Through the small window, Clark could see his house, lit up like a beacon, beautiful and hollow. And standing in the doorway, framed by golden light and dying celebration, was Kieran. Alone. Finally understanding that her carefully constructed life had just collapsed, and there was no one left to blame but herself. The emergency room at St. Catherine's Hospital was brightly lit and brutally efficient. Clark sat beside Raina's gurney in an exam bay, curtains pulled partway around them for privacy that didn't really exist. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking her vital signs with mechanical indifference. And 4-pump hummed. Nurses moved in and out with purposeful urgency, their faces professionally neutral, but their eyes holding sympathy. One had already drawn blood. Another had updated Raina's chart with notes that would later become evidence. A doctor was expected soon. Despite the oxygen mask and obvious exhaustion, Raina was more alert now that she was warm and receiving fluids. The color was slowly returning to her cheeks, though she still looked impossibly fragile against the white hospital linens. Her eyes tracked Clark's face, reading the guilt and rage there like a book she'd memorized. She reached out with the hand not tethered to the fore and touched his arm. When he looked up, she saw tears streaming down his face, tears he didn't seem to realize he was crying. Don't, she whispered, her voice muffled by the mask but still carrying that maternal authority that had shaped his entire life. Not your fault, baby. It is, Mama. Clark's voice broke completely, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been holding back since the basement. I should have checked on you. I should have questioned her. I was so busy with the business, with closing deals, with impressing people who don't matter. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to stop the tears. You raised me to pay attention, to protect the people I love. And I failed you. God, Mama, I failed you so badly. Raina squeezed his arm with what little strength she had. You saved me, she said simply. That's what matters. I almost didn't. The words tore out of him. If I hadn't heard that sound, if I hadn't listened to my instincts, you would have died down there. Alone. In the dark. While I was upstairs drinking champagne. The curtain pulled back and Dr. Emily Martinez entered. A calm, competent woman in her 40s wearing scrubs and a white coat. She was followed by a nurse with a tablet. Dr. Martinez pulled up a stool and sat, which Clark appreciated. Doctors who towered over patients while delivering news had always bothered him. Mr. Moreno? I'm Dr. Martinez. Let's talk about your mother's condition. She pulled up chest x-rays on the tablet and turned it so Clark could see the cloudy white areas that looked like storm clouds filling both lungs. Mrs. Moreno has severe bacterial pneumonia in both lungs. She's also significantly dehydrated and showing early signs of sepsis. That's when an infection spreads into the bloodstream. Clark's hands clenched into fists. Each medical term felt like another indictment of his failure. We've started aggressive 4 antibiotics and fluids, Dr. Martinez continued, her voice gentle but honest. She'll need to be admitted, possibly to intensive care for at least the first 24 hours while we monitor her response to treatment. Is she going to be okay? The question came out barely louder than a whisper, because Clark wasn't sure he could handle the answer. Dr. Martinez paused, and that pause told him everything. Professional honesty warring with the desire to provide comfort. With treatment, her prognosis is good, she said carefully. But I need to be honest with you. If she'd gone another day, maybe 2, without medical intervention, she trailed off meaningfully. We'd be having a very different conversation, possibly in a different part of the hospital. The morgue, Clark thought. She meant the morgue. His wife had nearly killed his mother through calculated neglect. Not in a moment of passion or rage, but through cold, deliberate actions sustained over days. The realization made him feel physically sick. A new presence at the curtain made them both look up. A woman in business casual attire held up a badge. Detective Lisa Brennan, County Police. Her face was professional, but her eyes held barely concealed anger. Mr. Moreno? I'm Detective Brennan. The hospital is required to report certain injuries and situations. I need to ask some questions about your mother's condition. Clark had expected this. Wanted this even. Yes. I want to file a formal report. Criminal charges. Everything. Beside him, Raina made a small sound of protest, trying to shake her head despite the oxygen mask. Even now, even after everything, she didn't want to cause trouble. It was so characteristic of her. Always putting others first, always smoothing over conflicts, always absorbing pain rather than inflicting it, that Clark almost smiled through his tears. Mama, no, he said firmly, taking her hand. She locked you in a basement. She withheld your medication. She could have killed you. This isn't something we can let go. Raina's eyes filled with tears. She pulled the oxygen mask down slightly, her voice hoarse. She's your wife, baby. Your family. You're my family, Clark corrected, his voice fierce. You've always been my family. She's just someone I made a terrible mistake with. Detective Brennan pulled out a notepad, her expression softening slightly at the exchange. Over the next 30 minutes, Clark recounted everything. The party, Kieran's deflections, the suspicious sounds, the padlock newly installed on the basement door. He showed Detective Brennan the photos on his phone, each one a damning piece of evidence. The detective's jaw tightened as she viewed the images. We'll need Mrs. Moreno's statement when she's able to give one, she said. And we'll need to document the scene before anything is disturbed. I'm opening an investigation into elder abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and reckless endangerment. She paused, meeting Clark's eyes. I want you to understand. Your wife will likely face criminal charges. This could result in jail time. Good, Clark said without hesitation. She deserves it. After Detective Brennan left with promises to follow up, Clark returned his full attention to his mother. Raina had pulled the oxygen mask back into place, but her eyes were pleading with him, trying to communicate something. He lowered the mask gently. "What is it, Mama? Do you know why she did it?" Raina asked quietly. "Really, why?" Clark nodded slowly, the truth sitting heavy in his chest. "I know. I heard it in her voice, in what she didn't say. She was ashamed of you, of who you are, of where I came from." The words felt like poison on his tongue. Raina's face showed pain that had nothing to do with pneumonia, nothing to do with 3 days in a cold basement. This was deeper pain. Soul pain. "Because I'm black," Raina said softly, stating the truth they'd both been dancing around. "Because I don't fit her image of what a millionaire's mother should look like. Because when people see me with you, they remember you didn't come from money, that you came from nothing, from nowhere. From love," Clark corrected fiercely, gripping her hand. "I came from love. You gave me everything that mattered. Everything I am, everything good about me, that came from you." "But she didn't see it that way," Raina said. "She saw a problem, something that needed to be managed, hidden." "I knew," Raina admitted, her voice barely audible. "From the beginning. The way she looked at me. The way she'd correct my grammar like I was a child. How she'd steer you away whenever I started telling stories about when you were young, about the neighborhood, about our life before the money." Clark's hands clenched. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you loved her," Raina said simply, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Because you were happy. Because I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe I was being paranoid. And because," she paused, her voice breaking, "because I know what it's like to be judged for who you love." She told him then what he'd never fully understood. How she'd faced judgment when she adopted him. A single black woman in her 30s taking in a 7-year-old mixed-race child from a broken home. How her church questioned her decision, called it foolish, warned that she was taking on too much. How neighbors whispered that she was trying to be a white savior, that she couldn't possibly understand what that boy needed. "But you were mine the moment I saw you," she said, her hand trembling in his. "Just like Kieran was yours when you met her. I understood that kind of love. So I stayed quiet. I thought," she broke off, coughing weakly, "I thought love would be enough." "Your silence almost killed you, Mama," Clark said, his voice rough with emotion. "But your love saved me," Raina replied. "That's what matters. You heard me. You felt something was wrong. You came looking. You broke down that door. You chose me." A nurse returned to inform them that a room was ready upstairs. ICU, just as the doctor had warned. As they prepared to move Raina, Mrs. Patterson appeared at the curtain, still wearing her Christmas party dress, slightly disheveled now, her makeup smudged from crying. "I came as soon as I found out which hospital," she said breathlessly, rushing to Raina's side. "Oh honey, I'm so sorry. If I'd known, if any of us had known." "No one knew," Raina said gently. "That was the point." But Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "I should have asked more questions. When you stopped coming to book club, when Kieran said you were too tired for visitors, I should have insisted. I should have called. I should have shown up." Other people began appearing. Former neighbors from the old neighborhood where Clark grew up. Members of the church Raina still attended every Sunday. Even some of Clark's business associates who actually knew and respected Raina, who'd spent time talking with her at events instead of just tolerating her presence. Over the next hour, as Raina got settled in her ICU room, a steady stream of visitors appeared. People who genuinely cared. People who brought flowers they'd grabbed from all-night grocery stores. People who'd driven hours through Christmas Eve traffic because they'd heard what happened and needed to see for themselves that Raina was alive. The room filled with love. Real love. Not the performative kind that had filled the mansion. Clark watched this outpouring and realized something profound. Kieran had thrown a party full of people who barely knew his mother's name. People who'd accepted her absence with casual indifference. These people, some of them struggling financially, some of them exhausted from long shifts, some of them elderly themselves, these were the ones who showed up when it mattered. Wealth didn't create community. Love did. As midnight approached, most visitors had gone home, promising to return tomorrow. Mrs. Patterson remained, sitting on one side of Raina's bed while Clark sat on the other. Between them, Raina slept peacefully for the first time in days, her breathing easier with the oxygen and antibiotics working through her system. The monitors beeped steadily. Outside the window, Christmas lights decorated the city, twinkling like earthbound stars. And Clark realized that despite everything, the betrayal, the pain, the near tragedy, this moment right here, this quiet, humble moment in a hospital room with people who genuinely cared, this was what Christmas was supposed to be. Not chandeliers and champagne. Not performance and pretense. Just love. Simple, honest, life-saving love. He looked at his mother's sleeping face and whispered a promise into the sterile hospital air. Never again, Mama. I'll never choose wrong again. I'll never let anyone make you invisible. Never. Outside, Christmas Eve became Christmas morning, and for the first time in 3 days, both mother and son could breathe. Christmas morning arrived without joy in the Moreno mansion. The house that had glowed so brilliantly just 12 hours earlier now sat in shadowed silence. Decorations that had seemed elegant in candlelight looked garish and excessive in the cold dawn. Half-empty champagne glasses littered tables. Discarded napkins dotted the floor like fallen snow. The catering staff had packed up and left sometime after midnight, once word spread about what had happened in the basement. The mansion felt haunted by its own opulence. Kieran stood in the master bedroom, surrounded by designer luggage she'd spent the past 3 hours packing. Her hands shook as she folded clothes with mechanical precision. Chanel jackets, Valentino dresses, shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Each item represented the life she'd built, the image she'd crafted so carefully. All of it disintegrating like tissue paper in rain. Her phone sat on the dresser, screen dark, but she knew what was there. 37 missed calls. 62 text messages. Most from friends, former friends, she corrected herself, who'd been at the party, who'd witnessed everything, who'd seen Raina carried from the basement, who'd heard Clark's public declaration of what Kieran had done. Some messages were outraged. Some were disgusted. A few were from people distancing themselves with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship. I think we need space right now. This is a lot to process. I had no idea you were capable of something like this. But it was her mother's voicemail that cut deepest. Margaret Whitmore, society matriarch, a woman who'd taught Kieran that appearance was everything, that the right image opened every door, that certain people simply didn't belong in certain spaces. Kieran Elizabeth Whitmore, her mother's voice was ice cold. Whatever I taught you, it was never cruelty. It was never abuse. You've disgraced yourself. You've disgraced this family. Don't call me until you've figured out how to fix this. If it can even be fixed. Even her own mother had turned away. Kieran sat on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Clark for 5 years, and for the first time since this nightmare began, allowed herself to really look at what she'd done. She'd locked a sick 65-year-old woman in a basement. For 3 days. Without medication. Without warmth. Without basic human dignity. She'd done it because Raina embarrassed her. Because when business associates met Clark's adoptive black mother, they saw the truth beneath the tailored suits and expensive watches. They saw a self-made man who'd clawed his way up from poverty, not someone born into the right family with the right connections. And Kieran had spent 5 years trying to erase that truth. She remembered the first time she'd met Raina, 3 months into dating Clark. They'd gone to Raina's modest house in the old neighborhood, a far cry from the penthouse where Clark lived by then. The house was small but immaculate, filled with photos of young Clark at every age, with the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen, with warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Raina had welcomed Kieran with genuine affection, pulling her into a hug that felt maternal and safe. She'd spent hours telling stories about raising Clark, about his first day of school, about how he'd taught himself to code using library computers, about the night he'd gotten his first big contract and cried in her kitchen because he could finally pay her back. "You never had to pay me back, baby," Raina had said to him that night, her hand on his cheek. "You were never a debt. You were always a gift." Kieran had watched that interaction and felt. What? Not jealousy exactly. Something deeper. The realization that no matter what she did, she would never be the most important woman in Clark's life. That position was permanently occupied by a woman who represented everything Kieran had spent her life trying to rise above. The classism had been there from the beginning, buried beneath polite smiles and appropriate comments. But somewhere along the way, it had twisted into something darker, into resentment, into contempt, into the kind of prejudice that allowed her to justify locking a sick woman in a basement. How did I become this person? Kieran thought, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. When did I become someone capable of this? But she knew the answer. It had been gradual. Small justifications building on each other like layers of paint until the original surface was completely obscured. Steering Clark away when Raina told stories about their old neighborhood. Scheduling important dinners on nights Raina usually visited. Suggesting gently that maybe Raina would be more comfortable staying home during certain business events. Each action defensible in isolation. Collectively, they formed a pattern of erasure. And when Raina got sick, when she became not just an embarrassment, but a potential liability during the most important social event of the year, Kieran had made a choice. She'd chosen image over humanity, status over compassion, pride over love. And now she was paying the price. A car door slammed outside. Kieran moved to the window and saw Clark's Mercedes pulling into the driveway. Her heart lurched. Part of her wanted to run downstairs, to beg forgiveness, to somehow explain in a way that would make him understand. But she knew there was no explanation that could justify what she'd done. No words that could erase the image of his mother wrapped in inadequate blankets on a concrete floor. Clark entered the house, and Kieran heard his footsteps on the marble floor. Slower than usual, weighted with exhaustion. She heard him pause in the hallway, probably looking at the remnants of the party. Then his footsteps continued upward, climbing the grand staircase. Kieran stood frozen as his steps approached the bedroom. The door opened. They stood looking at each other across the space that used to be theirs. Clark's eyes were red from crying and lack of sleep. He still wore his dress shirt from last night, now wrinkled and stained with basement dust. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 12 hours. "How is she?" Kieran asked quietly, hating how her voice shook. "Stable," Clark said, his voice carefully neutral. "The antibiotics are working. Dr. Martinez thinks she'll recover fully. Physically, at least." The implication hung between them. Physical recovery didn't erase trauma. Didn't erase the knowledge that someone you trusted had tried to erase you. "Clark, Kieran began. "Don't." He held up his hand, stopping her. "I came back to get some things for Mama. Clothes, her medications, some photos from her room. Then I'm going back to the hospital. Can we talk? Please. I know I can't undo what I did, but if I could just explain." "Explain what?" Clark's voice hardened. "Explain why you thought my mother's life was worth less than your social image? Explain why you locked a sick woman in a basement during Christmas? What possible explanation exists for that, Kieran?" Tears streamed down her face. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I was scared." "Scared of what?" Clark demanded. "A 65-year-old woman who loved you, who welcomed you into our family, who prayed for our marriage every Sunday at church. Scared that I'd never measure up." The words burst out of Kieran like a confession she'd been holding back for years. "Scared that everyone would see I wasn't enough for you. That I was just some shallow society girl who didn't deserve a man who'd built himself from nothing. That next to her genuine goodness and her real love, I was just hollow." Clark stared at her, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not forgiveness, but maybe understanding. Maybe recognition that hurt people. That insecurity left to fester becomes cruelty. You're right, he said quietly. You are hollow, because you had the chance to learn from her, to become a better person through knowing her, and instead you tried to erase her. You saw her goodness, and instead of aspiring to it, you resented it. He moved past her to Raina's room down the hall. Kieran followed, watching as he carefully selected items. Raina's favorite cardigan, the photo album she kept on her nightstand, her Bible with decades of margin notes, the small jewelry box that held her late husband's wedding ring. He moved with such tenderness, such care, treating each object like it was precious. The way he should have been treating the person who owned them all along. Detective Brennan called. Clark said without looking at her. They're filing charges. Elder abuse, false imprisonment, reckless endangerment. Your lawyer should contact you soon about arraignment. Kieran felt the floor tilt beneath her. Clark, please. Don't let them do this. We can handle this privately. We can. We. Clark turned to face her, his eyes blazing. There is no we anymore, Kieran. There's you, facing the consequences of your actions. And there's me, trying to help my mother heal from what you did to her. He picked up the bag he'd packed with Raina's belongings. As he walked past Kieran toward the door, he paused. I loved you, he said, his voice breaking on the past tense. I really did. I thought we were building something real. But you know what I realized sitting in that hospital room last night, watching my mother fight pneumonia that should have killed her? Kieran waited, tears streaming down her face. I realized I didn't know you at all. The woman I loved, she didn't exist. She was just a performance. And underneath it was someone capable of locking my mother in a basement to die. He shook his head. I don't know who you are, but I know I don't want to. Clark. Goodbye, Kieran. He walked out. His footsteps descended the stairs, crossed the marble entryway, and then the front door closed with a finality that echoed through the empty mansion. Kieran stood alone in the hallway of a house that no longer felt like hers, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a prison, facing a future that looked nothing like the one she'd carefully planned. Outside, Christmas morning continued. Families were opening presents. Children were laughing. People were gathering around tables laden with food and love. And Kieran was utterly, completely, deservedly alone. She returned to the bedroom and sat on the bed, staring at her packed luggage. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from her lawyer, using words like criminal charges and media exposure and prepare for the worst. For the first time in her adult life, Kieran's carefully cultivated composure cracked completely. She doubled over, sobbing, mourning not just her marriage or her reputation, but the person she could have been if she'd chosen differently. If she'd chosen love over image. If she'd chosen humanity over pride. But those choices were behind her now, buried under 3 days of cruelty that could never be undone. All she had left was consequence. And in the silence of Christmas morning, consequence felt like the loneliest thing in the world. 2 weeks passed like a slow exhale after holding your breath too long. Raina spent 6 days in the hospital, 3 in ICU, 3 more in a regular room as her lungs cleared and her strength returned. Clark never left her side except to shower and change clothes in a hotel room he'd rented 3 blocks away. He slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair, ate vending machine food, and conducted business meetings via video call from a corner of her room while she napped. He'd built a multi-million-dollar empire, but none of it mattered as much as watching his mother's color return, hearing her breathe without that terrifying rattle, seeing her smile reach her eyes again. On the 7th day, Dr. Martinez cleared her for discharge with strict instructions. Rest, medication schedule, follow-up appointments, and absolutely no stress. Clark hired a private nurse for the transition period. He'd also done something else, something he hadn't told Raina about yet. When the hospital wheelchair brought her to the entrance, Raina expected to see Clark's Mercedes. Instead, a modest SUV waited, and standing beside it was a face that made her gasp with joy. Naomi. Naomi Chun. No, Naomi Williams now, rushed forward with tears streaming down her face. Raina's goddaughter, who'd moved to Seattle 8 years ago for a job opportunity and whom Raina hadn't seen in person in 3 years. A young woman Raina had mentored through college, through her first broken heart, through her mother's death from cancer. Aunt Raina. Naomi embraced her carefully, mindful of her still healing body. Clark called me, told me everything. I took emergency leave from work. I'm staying as long as you need me. Raina looked at Clark, who shrugged with a small smile. The first genuine smile she'd seen on his face since that terrible night. You need family around you, Mama, he said simply. Real family. The SUV didn't head toward the mansion. Instead, Clark drove them to a different neighborhood entirely. One Raina recognized with growing confusion, and then wonder. It was her old neighborhood, the one where she'd raised Clark. The modest, tree-lined streets where she'd lived for 40 years before Clark insisted on buying her a suite in his mansion. They pulled up to her old house. The small bungalow looked exactly as she remembered, but different somehow. Fresh paint brightened the exterior. The garden she'd lovingly tended for decades had been professionally restored. New shutters framed the windows. The front porch, where she used to sit with young Clark, teaching him to read, had been rebuilt and expanded. What is this? Raina whispered, her hand pressed to her chest. Clark helped her out of the car, supporting her weight as they walked up the path. You never wanted to leave this house, he said quietly. You only moved to the mansion because I pressured you. Because I wanted you close, wanted to give you a better life. He shook his head. But this was always your home. Your real home. He unlocked the door, and Raina stepped inside to find her house transformed but familiar. All her furniture had been returned. Pieces Clark had put in storage when she moved. Her photos covered the walls. Her books filled the shelves. But everything had been updated. New heating system, renovated kitchen and bathroom, fresh paint, refinished floors. In the corner of the living room stood a small Christmas tree, simply decorated with handmade ornaments she recognized from Clark's childhood. Her old piano, the one she'd sold to help pay for Clark's college textbooks, sat against the wall, restored to beautiful condition. Raina burst into tears. Clark wrapped his arms around her, and they stood there in the entryway of her reclaimed home, both crying, both healing, both understanding something profound about what home actually means. You're staying here, Clark said. I've hired Mrs. Patterson's daughter, she's a certified home health aide, to check on you daily. Naomi's staying in the guest room for the next month. I'm 10 minutes away if you need anything. But Mama, this is your space. Your home. No one can take it from you. No one can lock you out of it. It's yours. I had the deed transferred to your name alone. Legally protected. Later that evening, as Raina sat in her favorite chair, the worn recliner Clark had wanted to throw away, but she'd insisted on keeping. With a blanket over her lap and tea steaming on the side table, she watched her home fill with people. Mrs. Patterson arrived with homemade soup. Members from Raina's church brought casseroles and fresh bread. Former neighbors stopped by with flowers and warm embraces. Naomi orchestrated it all, managing the flow of visitors, ensuring Raina didn't get overtired, creating the kind of community celebration that fed the soul. This was so different from the mansion party 2 weeks ago. No champagne, no crystal, no designer dresses. Just real people in everyday clothes, bringing food in mismatched containers, sitting on secondhand furniture, laughing and crying and sharing stories. This was real wealth. Human wealth. The kind that couldn't be bought or performed. The kind that showed up when it mattered. Clark sat on the floor beside his mother's chair, and she ran her fingers through his hair the way she used to when he was 7 years old and afraid of the dark. When he'd crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, and she'd hold him and promise that the morning always came, that darkness never lasted forever. You did good, baby, she said softly, just for him. You found your way back. I almost lost you finding it, Clark replied, his voice thick with emotion. But you didn't. You heard me. You felt something was wrong, and you listened to that feeling. That's what matters. She paused, gathering courage for something she needed to say. "Clark, I forgive her." Clark's head snapped up. "Mama, I forgive her," Raina repeated firmly. "Not for her sake. For mine. Because carrying that anger, that bitterness, it would kill me just as surely as that basement would have. I won't give her that power. She doesn't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not," Raina agreed. "But I deserve my peace. And forgiveness is how I get it." She touched his face gently. "I'm not saying what she did was okay. I'm not saying there shouldn't be consequences. I'm just saying I won't let what she did poison the rest of my life." Clark closed his eyes, overwhelmed by his mother's grace. Even now, even after everything, she was teaching him, showing him that strength wasn't about revenge or holding grudges. It was about choosing healing over hurt, peace over bitterness. "I don't know if I can forgive her," Clark admitted. "You will," Raina said. "Eventually. When you're ready. Forgiveness isn't about timelines. It's about freedom." Across the room, Naomi was showing Mrs. Patterson photos on her phone. Pictures of her wedding that Raina had missed because of the distance and her health at the time. Laughter bubbled up as Naomi described the ceremony mishaps, the cake disaster, the flower girl who'd sat down mid-aisle and refused to move. Pastor Williams from Raina's church arrived with his wife, bringing more food and their famous peach cobbler. He'd been the one who'd supported Raina's decision to adopt Clark 33 years ago, who'd prayed with her during the hardest years, who'd officiated her husband's funeral. "Sister Raina," he said warmly, taking her hands. "The whole church has been praying. We're so grateful you're home." "Thank you, Pastor," Raina said. "For everything. For all these years." As evening deepened, most visitors departed with promises to return soon. Naomi cleaned up the kitchen while Clark helped his mother prepare for bed. He made sure her medications were organized, that the home health monitor was properly set up, that she had everything within easy reach. Tucking her into her own bed, in her own room, felt like closing a circle that had been broken. "Get some rest, Mama," he said, kissing her forehead. "I'll be back tomorrow morning." "Clark," she called as he reached the door. "Thank you for bringing me home. For understanding that bigger isn't always better. That expensive isn't always valuable. I should have understood it sooner," he said. "You understood it when it mattered," Raina replied. "That's enough." In his car, driving through the quiet streets toward his hotel, Clark felt something shift inside him. The guilt was still there. Probably would be for a long time. But beneath it, something new was growing. Hope, maybe. The possibility of healing. The understanding that love sometimes means letting go of what you thought you wanted and embracing what's actually needed. His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. The divorce papers were ready for his signature. Kieran's criminal trial was scheduled for March. The mansion was being listed for sale. Clark couldn't imagine ever living there again, couldn't walk those halls without seeing his mother locked in the basement below. He was starting over, rebuilding from a foundation of truth instead of image. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Clark pulled over in an empty parking lot and sat with his hands on the steering wheel, watching the streetlights flicker on as darkness settled over the city. He thought about the past 2 weeks. The hospital vigils, the police statements, the media coverage he'd had to navigate, the business associates who'd quietly distanced themselves when the story broke. He'd lost some things. His marriage, his reputation in certain circles, the comfortable belief that he could trust his own judgment about people. But he'd gained something more important. He'd reclaimed his mother. He'd reconnected with the community that had supported them both before wealth complicated everything. He'd remembered who he was beneath the suits and the success. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo from earlier today. Raina in her favorite chair, surrounded by people who loved her, laughing at something Pastor Williams said, looking more alive than she had in months, maybe years. This was success. Not the mansion or the business deals or the impressive portfolio. This, right here. His mother safe and happy and home. Everything else was just noise. Clark started the car and drove toward tomorrow, toward healing, toward the long journey of rebuilding trust. With his mother, with himself, with the belief that people could change, could grow, could find their way back to what mattered. The night was cold but clear, and somewhere above the city lights, stars were shining, reminding him that even in the darkest moments, light persisted. Even in the deepest betrayal, love survived. Even in the most broken places, healing was possible. He just had to believe it, had to work for it, had to choose it every single day. And for the first time since that terrible Christmas Eve, Clark believed he could. 6 months later, June. The community center in Raina's old neighborhood buzzed with life on a warm Saturday afternoon. Children's laughter echoed from the playground outside. Inside, folding tables were covered with donated books, clothing, and household items. Volunteers moved between stations, helping families who'd fallen on hard times find what they needed without the sting of charity. Everything was offered with dignity, with respect, with the understanding that circumstances change, but human worth remains constant. At the center of it all, directing traffic with gentle authority and infectious joy, was Raina Moreno. She looked transformed from that broken woman Clark had carried from a basement 6 months ago. Her silver hair was styled in elegant braids. Her dark skin glowed with health. She wore a simple purple dress and comfortable shoes, moving with energy that belied her 65 years. The pneumonia had left some lingering effects. She tired more easily, had to be careful in cold weather. But her spirit had not just recovered. It had flourished. This community center was her new project. Clark had funded it, but Raina ran it. She'd insisted on that division. His money, her vision. A partnership that honored both their strengths without anyone being diminished. The Moreno Family Community Center, named for both of them, had opened 3 months ago and had already become a lifeline for the neighborhood. After-school programs for kids, job training for adults, a food pantry that operated with dignity, support groups for single parents, for people in recovery, for anyone who needed community. This was Raina's domain, her kingdom, and she ruled it with love. Clark stood near the entrance, watching his mother interact with a young single mother who looked exhausted and overwhelmed. Raina was showing her the clothing section, helping her find professional outfits for job interviews, slipping gift cards for the local grocery store into her bag when she thought no one was looking. "She's remarkable," a voice said beside him. Clark turned to find Naomi, who decided to relocate permanently back to the area. She now served as the community center's assistant director, working alongside Raina to expand their programs. "She always has been," Clark replied. "I just forgot for a while." "You remembered when it mattered," Naomi said, echoing Raina's words from months ago. "That's what counts." A commotion at the door drew their attention. Detective Lisa Brennan entered, not in her usual professional attire but in jeans and a t-shirt, accompanied by 2 teenage boys who looked uncomfortable and defensive. Raina spotted them immediately and approached with a warm smile that seemed to disarm the boys' hostility almost instantly. "Detective Brennan," Raina greeted her. "And these must be the young men you told me about." "Yes, ma'am," Brennan replied. "Marcus and Devon. They're part of the youth diversion program. I thought maybe you could use some volunteers today." It was phrased as a question, but everyone understood what was really happening. These boys had made mistakes. Shoplifting, vandalism, the kind of trouble that stemmed from boredom and lack of opportunity rather than malice. Instead of formal charges, they were being given a chance to serve their community. Raina had specifically requested to work with kids like this. She understood that one person's belief could change a trajectory. She'd proven it with Clark 33 years ago. "We absolutely can," Raina said, extending her hand to each boy in turn. "I'm Mrs. Moreno. How are you gentlemen at organizing donations?" The boys mumbled something that might have been agreement, clearly expecting judgment or condescension. Instead, Raina treated them like the capable young men they could become, giving them real responsibility, real work, real dignity. Clark watched his mother work her quiet magic and felt his chest tighten with pride and love. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. Final divorce decree signed. It's official. You're free. Clark stared at the message for a long moment. The divorce had been inevitable but complicated. Kieran had pleaded guilty to reduced charges, elder abuse and reckless endangerment, receiving 18 months in county jail plus probation and mandatory counseling. The criminal trial had been brief but devastating, her lawyer advising her that fighting the charges would only result in harsher sentencing. The media coverage had been brutal. Socialite Locke's mother-in-law in basement had been splashed across headlines for weeks. Kieran's friends had abandoned her. Her mother had publicly disowned her. She'd lost everything: marriage, reputation, freedom. Clark hadn't attended the sentencing, hadn't visited her in jail, hadn't responded to the 3 letters she'd sent, each one apparently filled with apologies he wasn't ready to read. But Raina had visited. Once a month, she took the bus to the county detention center and sat across from Kieran in the visitor's room. She never told Clark exactly what they talked about, saying only that everyone deserved the chance to be seen as human, even in their worst moments. "I'm not doing it for her," Raina had explained when Clark questioned whether Kieran deserved such grace. "I'm doing it because it's who I am. Because somebody has to believe people can change. Somebody has to hold the door open, even if they choose not to walk through it." Clark didn't know if he could ever reach that level of forgiveness. But he was learning, slowly, with his mother as his teacher, just as she'd always been. A small hand tugged at his sleeve. He looked down to find a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "Are you Mr. Clark?" she asked. "I am," he replied, kneeling to her level. "My mama says you're the nice man who helped us when Daddy left," she said with the blunt honesty of children. "She says you gave us money for food and helped her find a job." Clark's throat tightened. He'd set up an emergency assistance fund through the community center, providing no questions asked help for families in crisis. He hadn't realized the recipients knew his name. "Your mama is very brave," he said gently, "and you're very strong for helping her." The girl beamed and ran off to rejoin her mother, who waved gratefully from across the room. These moments happened regularly now. People whose lives had been quietly changed by programs Clark funded but Raina administered. Single mothers who'd found childcare so they could work. Teenagers who'd discovered purpose through mentorship programs. Elderly folks who came to the center for companionship and found community. This was what wealth was meant for. Not crystal chandeliers and champagne. Not impressing people who didn't matter. This, lifting people up, creating opportunity, building community. Clark had restructured his entire business philosophy after Christmas. He'd sold the mansion and moved into a modest home in Raina's neighborhood. Close enough to check on her daily, far enough to respect her independence. He'd shifted his company's focus towards social impact, investing in affordable housing, educational programs, community development. Some business associates thought he'd lost his edge. Others quietly admired his transformation. His profit margins had actually improved. Turned out that investing in people created loyal customers and dedicated employees. But the numbers mattered less now. Success looked different through his new lens. As afternoons shifted toward evening, the community center began to empty. Volunteers cleaned up. The 2 teenage boys, Marcus and Devin, had worked diligently all day, their defensive postures gradually softening under Raina's patient guidance. As they prepared to leave, Raina stopped them. "You did good work today," she said. "Real good work. I'd like you to come back next Saturday if you're willing. Not for the program. That'll be completed after your required hours. But because I could actually use your help. You're both smart and capable, and this place needs young men who understand what it's like to need a second chance." The boys exchanged glances, something shifting in their expressions. Being needed was different than being sentenced. Being valued was different than being punished. "Yeah, okay," Marcus said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide his pleased expression. "We could probably do that." After they left with Detective Brennan, Raina sank into a chair with a satisfied sigh. Clark brought her a bottle of water and sat beside her. "You're going to change their lives," he said. "Maybe," Raina replied. "Or maybe I'm just showing them somebody believes they're worth the effort. That's all any of us really need, baby. To know somebody sees us. Sees our worth even when we can't see it ourselves." Clark took her hand. The hand that had held his through nightmares and first days of school, through awkward adolescence and college graduation, through every important moment of his life. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for never giving up on me, for teaching me what actually matters, for being the best example of humanity I've ever known." Raina squeezed his hand. "You were always my greatest gift, Clark. From the moment they placed you in my arms, this scared little 7-year-old who'd been hurt so many times, I knew my life had purpose. Loving you, raising you, watching you become this good man." She paused, her eyes glistening. "That's been my greatest honor." They sat in comfortable silence as the June evening painted golden light through the community center windows. Outside, children played in the fading daylight. Families walked home carrying bags of donated items. The neighborhood pulsed with life, not perfect life, not wealthy life, but real life. Connected life. Community life. "I got the final divorce papers today," Clark said eventually. "It's official." Raina nodded, unsurprised. "How do you feel?" "Relieved. Sad. Guilty that I didn't see who she really was. Grateful that you survived her." He paused. "I heard you visited her again last week." "I did." "Why, Mama?" "After everything she did." "Because somebody has to show her what grace looks like," Raina interrupted gently. "Whether she accepts it or not isn't my concern. My concern is being the person I want to be, regardless of how others behave." Clark shook his head in wonder. "I don't know if I'll ever be that good." "You don't have to be me, baby. You just have to be you. The best version of you. And you're already becoming him." She gestured to the community center around them. This is who you are when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to help them. I'm proud of the man you've become." Again, as they locked up the center and walked to their cars in the parking lot, Raina suddenly stopped. "You know what today is?" she asked. Clark thought for a moment, then realized. 6 months exactly. 6 months since. "Since you broke down that door," Raina finished. "Since you chose me. Since everything changed." "Worst and best Christmas of my life," Clark said. "Mine too," Raina agreed. "I thought I was going to die in that basement, Clark. I really did. But you know what I kept thinking about in those darkest moments?" "What?" "That promise we made to each other when you were 7. You'll never be alone, I told you. And you said, promise?" And I said, cross my heart." She smiled, tears spilling over. 33 years later, you kept that promise right back. You didn't leave me alone. You found me. You saved me." Clark pulled his mother into a fierce embrace right there in the parking lot, both of them crying, both of them healing, both of them understanding that some bonds couldn't be broken by cruelty or circumstance or even death. "Never alone, Mama," he whispered. "Cross my heart." 3 months later, September, the Moreno Family Community Center held its first annual fundraising gala. Not in a mansion, but right there in the center's multipurpose room, decorated simply but beautifully by volunteers. The dress code was come as you are. Some people wore their Sunday best, others wore jeans, and everyone was welcomed exactly the same. Raina gave a speech that brought everyone to tears, talking about second chances and community, and how the measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members. She spoke about her own journey, from poverty to parenthood, from abandonment to purpose. And she spoke about Christmas Eve, about the basement, about her son who'd heard her cry for help and hadn't stopped until he found her. "We all have a choice," she told the packed room. "We can build walls or we can build bridges. We can lock people out or we can invite them in. We can judge worth by wallet size or we can recognize that every single person carries infinite value." She looked directly at Clark, who stood near the back, trying unsuccessfully not to cry. My son taught me something 6 months ago, Raina continued. He taught me that love always finds a way, that truth always rises, that no door is too locked, no darkness too deep, no distance too far when someone refuses to give up on you. The applause was thunderous. After the gala, as Clark drove Raina home through streets filled with memories, she rested her hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "I'm proud of us," Clark replied. "We survived. We healed. We're building something beautiful from something terrible." "That's what love does," Raina said. "It transforms. It redeems. It makes beauty from ashes." They pulled up to her house, the small bungalow that had never stopped being home. Lights glowed warmly from inside. The garden bloomed with late summer flowers. Everything felt right. As Clark walked his mother to her door, she paused on the porch. The same porch where she'd first welcomed a scared 7-year-old boy and promised him he'd never be alone again. "You know what I'm grateful for?" Raina asked. "What, Mama?" "That basement," she said quietly. "I'm grateful it happened." Clark's eyes widened with shock. "Mama, I'm grateful," she continued, "because it brought you back to yourself. It reminded both of us what actually matters. It broke open something that needed breaking so real love could grow." She touched his face with her weathered hand, the hand that had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, that had held him through every hurt, that had built a life from nothing but love and determination. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to remember what we can't afford to lose," she said. "You almost lost me. But in not losing me, you found yourself again. You found us again. You found what home really means." Clark kissed his mother's forehead, overwhelmed with gratitude and love and the profound understanding that despite everything, the betrayal, the pain, the near tragedy, they'd emerge stronger. Not unscathed, but unbroken. Not unchanged, but unbowed. Not perfect, but together. And together, they could face anything. Final reflection, CTA number 3. As Clark drove home that night, he thought about the journey from that terrible Christmas Eve to this September evening, about how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered while chasing things that didn't. He thought about Kieran, still serving her sentence, hopefully learning what Raina already knew, that worth isn't measured in designer labels or social status, but in how you treat people when no one's watching. He thought about the community center, about Marcus and Devin who now volunteered every week, about the single mothers finding their footing, about the children discovering they mattered. He thought about his mother, asleep in her own bed in her own home, safe and loved and surrounded by community. And he understood something fundamental. The greatest wealth wasn't in his bank account. It was in the hand that had held his when he was 7 and scared, in the voice that had promised him he'd never be alone, in the love that had survived abandonment and poverty and even attempted murder. That wealth could never be taken away. That wealth would last forever. That wealth was the only wealth that ever really mattered. When was the last time you really looked at the people who matter most in your life? When did you last tell them, not just with words, but with actions, that they're more valuable than any success, any reputation, any image you're trying to maintain? Life can change in a moment, and the people we take for granted can be lost before we realize how much we need them. Don't wait for a locked door and a desperate cry for help. Choose love today. Choose family today. Choose what actually matters before it's too late.
Thank you for watching the story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So, do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.